Neuvillette is a fantastic character, but he's not without his downsides. I was unsure about him to begin with, but through the story he won me over, and when he finally became playable, he was an instant favourite. But now, 6 months later, I find myself using him sparingly. He's still fantastic, but are there reasons any Genshin player should not pull for the Lord of Otters? Our first glimpse of Neuvillette came in the Overture teaser just before the release of Fontaine. Half of the Fontaine cast were revealed in that trailer, and while I was most excited about Navia, there were only 3 who I was unsure about. When it came to Neuvillette, I had mixed feelings. His hair is gorgeous, but his outfit felt a little busy compared to the style which grabbed my attention, and there was something ominous about both him and Clorinde. I love a villain when done right, but Genshin so far has been a little inconsistent and often make me less interested, so I reserved judgment until we got to know him. His first appearance in the Archon quest was a bit awkward, with Paimon once again putting her foot in, and Neuvillette came across as polite but reserved. He's the Chief Justice of Fontaine, and in the eyes of the people, only the Hydro Archon has greater authority. From the start, I enjoyed his relationship with Furina. At that point, I was a bit put off by her persona, so his long-suffering tone of exasperation resonated for me. His part in the opening act made it clear that my first impressions of Neuvillette were completely incorrect. Far from being the villain of the story, he ended up being its heart and soul. He has a calming presence from start to finish, with a quiet dignity I grew to love, and a strong moral compass which guides every action he takes. It becomes clear that he feels isolated and unsure of his place in the world, and despite his best efforts, he remains disconnected from the others around him. Over the course of the story, he begins to understand the reasons behind his situation, and for me, he became the emotional core of Fontaine. His stoicism throughout the early acts provided a stark contrast to the deep emotion he showed at the end, which is a major reason the final scene was so impactful. By the end of the Archon quests, he was firmly established as one of my favorite characters, up there with Nahida and Furina. Even his design grew on me, at least in part due to the adorable otters which match him so well. I was, however, a little disappointed by his story quest when I finally got around to it. While it was a moving story, I found my attention drifting, even though I played it on stream. Usually that keeps me more invested because I focus on keeping the narrative going so that people watching can experience it properly, but in this case, it didn't quite work for me. It's hard to pinpoint why it fell short, but I suspect it's at least in part because so much of his essential character growth was embedded into the Archon quests. I prefer this approach overall, since it makes the main quests more impactful, but in this case his story fell into the trap which made me unmoved by many story quests in previous regions. It centers more around new characters I haven't gotten to care about, and the character who was supposed to be the focus ends up feeling little more than an afterthought. I suspect it would have worked better if experienced in the middle of the main story rather than so long afterwards, so that it would feel a little more tied to his emotional journey, but I guess we'll never know. Neuvillette was released as a playable character in version 4.1, partway through the Archon quests. The first act had already changed my mind about him, so I was very much looking forward to wishing, and those wishes were painful, because my community decided that for every wish I had to do some exercise. You can watch the whole experience as a video, link in the description down below, but for once I got lucky and won my 50-50 at 78 pity after a grand total of 42 squats. My chat decided this wasn't enough punishment and enabled my wishing addiction, and a mere 33 squats later I got Neuvillette's signature weapon at the first try at 65 pity. This was by far the luckiest I've ever been on a new character banner. It was good enough that I could have wished for his first constellation, but I tend to prefer getting used to a character at C0 first and only consider pulling for constellations when they get a rerun. As I'll explain later, I'm very glad I made that decision. Before we get to that, let's look at his kit, build, and teams. Neuvillette is a Hydro Catalyst user. His normal attacks are fairly weak, but I kinda love the power and authority in the animations. His charge attacks are his special focus. He starts floating in the air, in a pose which honestly looks quite silly, and slowly accumulates power. If you release the button early, he shoots out a small splash of Hydro, though that's not something you do deliberately. Instead, you just keep holding down that button. Once fully charged, he unleashes a torrent of water which continuously damages any enemies in its path, while consuming some of Neuvillette's own HP. The strength and utility of this attack is fantastic, especially if you can group group enemies before unleashing his power, or use a high sensitivity mouse to make him spin ridiculously fast. While this attack is probably supposed to feel epic, it has always felt goofy to me, but I kinda love it. His burst and skill are similar to one another. They start with a big splash of damage and generate blue orbs called source water droplets on the field. 3 droplets from the skill, 6 from the burst. These droplets tie back to his special charged attack. While accumulating power, Neuvillette absorbs nearby droplets. Each droplet heals him and fills up his power meter. 3 droplets are enough to instantly fill his meter, which means that he can unleash 1 free torrent per skill and 2 per burst. So his role is as a main DPS, and he's potentially the most powerful in the game. Not only that, the healing when he absorbs droplets means that he can be self-sufficient even against difficult content. The only real downside to his kit, at C0 at least, is his vulnerability to interruption. This is an issue both while charging and while using his charge attack. Most rotations skip the charge time by relying on droplets for instant charges, but each torrent lasts 3 seconds, and if an enemy lands a hit during this time, it knocks him back and cancels the attack. As a result, he's best paired with a shield, a character who can boost interruption resistance, someone who can keep enemies still, or one who can produce a taunt. Or there's always his first constellation, but we'll talk about that in a minute. His first Ascension passive is also well worth paying attention to. His torrents gain a damage bonus which gets stronger when your team triggers different hydro elemental reactions. More on that when we look at his teams. Neuvillette turned out to be one of the easiest characters in the game to build. His damage scales off his HP stat, and HP is abundantly available in my experience, especially for Catalyst users. While his burst has a high cost, he generates a ton of particles on his own, so he needs surprisingly little energy recharge, with 130% being comfortable even with his least energy positive teams. The Tome of the Eternal Flow helps with his stats, but he does have a couple of other fantastic options which are much easier to obtain. Sacrificial Jade from the Battle Pass is his second best option, but the craftable prototype Amber is a close third and outclasses even other 5-star weapons. He's best built with HP Suns, a Hydro Damage or HP Goblet, and a Crit Ray, Crit Damage or HP Circlet depending on the mix of other stats available to him. His ideal set is 4-piece Marechaussee Hunter, which is tailor-made to him. The 2-piece bonus is a perfect fit, and the parts of his kit which drain and then replenish his HP mean that he keeps the 4-piece bonus active at all times, making him even easier to build. He could also use a 4-piece Heart of Death or some mixed 2-piece sets, but honestly these all pale in comparison to Marechaussee. I had already farmed Marechaussee extensively before even pulling for him and had a good build ready for him right from the start. I went with a Hydro Damage Goblet and a Crit Damage Circlet, and overall he had 30k HP, 140 ER and a fantastic 40 to 300 crit ratio, boosted to 76 to 300 by his artifact set. I recently leveled an alternate circlet for him with a HP main stat instead of a crit damage one, just to compare, ending up with a 40 to 234 crit ratio with 35k HP. Despite the loss of 60% crit damage, the jump in HP made such a difference that the overall damage was basically identical, with the HP circlet slightly edging ahead. Another perfect example of balanced stats being more important than crit value alone. So what about his teams? I've tried a ton of different combinations, but I tend to gravitate towards this hypercarry team with Furina, Baizu, and Kazuha, despite its slight disadvantages. As mentioned earlier, his A1 passive relies on the team triggering elemental reactions, so he's very much suited towards reaction teams, and it's rare to bring a second Hydro character. However, Furina's buff is so strong that it more than compensates for his buff being less effective, and of course Hydro Resonance boosts HP, which also makes up for the lack of reactions. Baizu maxes out her fanfare stacks with his incredible healing, while also providing his unique shield, which is perfect for Neuvillette's playstyle. Kazuha helps boost Furina and Neuvillette's damage even further and adds crowd control to the team. This team steamrolls anything in the game and is very satisfying to play, so it's pretty rare for me to stray away from this unless I want to try out something different. Charlotte is also a brilliant alternative to Baizu in this team, especially against freezable enemies, as she too can quickly max out Furina's buff. Aside from that, his teams are remarkably flexible. All he really wants is some protection and some other elements to react with. While I gravitate towards bringing along either Layla or Baizu for those purposes, they are far from his only options. He's a brilliant Hyperbloom driver. For example, Nahida, EM Raiden and Diona has a satisfying rotation if you mix Diona's tap and hold skill. Kuki is also a great trigger, especially when she has Constellations which extend her range. Alternatively, with a much stronger shielder like Layla or Zhongli, a healer is often unnecessary. Electrocharge is also a great fit for Neuvillette, though the focus here tends to skew more towards his personal damage rather than maximizing reaction damage. Fischl and Yaemiko are powerful partners, Lisa, Kuki and Dori work also, and I tend to bring an Anemo character to help build up his passive stacks. Since he applies Hydro across a gigantic area, his freeze teams are also fantastic against enemies who can be frozen. Again, these are a little more skewed towards focusing on his own damage, partly because of off-field cryo DPS characters are limited at the moment. Sub DPS Ganyu is my favorite pick here. He's also pretty fantastic in vaporized teams, though I've played with these the least. When that combination is beneficial, I tend to reach for my Hu Tao double Hydro instead. Overall, at C0, Neuvillette is incredibly powerful, flexible and easy to build, and pretty close to self-sufficient. His only noticeable downside is his tendency to be knocked around during the leisurely charged attacks, but that's easily solved by bringing along a shielder. Which leads me to the reason I've become less enamored with him over time. Even at C0, he's so strong that battles are often almost too easy. There is some joy to just destroying any enemy which comes with the range of his cannons, but at times there's so little challenge left that you might as well go play Power Wash Simulator instead of Genshin. Despite enjoying his playstyle, I tend to only bring him out if I simply want to clear something as fast as possible with no challenge, or I feel I need that extra power to push past a difficult chamber on floor 12. Those occasions are increasingly rare. And this would be worse if I also had his Constellations. His C1, as I hinted earlier, removes that one noticeable downside. He gains a pretty decent amount of interruption resistance, so he's no longer reliant on a shield. As if that wasn't enough, it also increases his damage output. His other Constellations all build up his damage even further and help him take up even more field time. While playing the Abyss for viewers a few weeks ago on Twitch, I got to try out a C3 Neuvillette. While it was a cool experience that one time, it did not change my mind. Even floor 12 felt like stomping hilly trails in the overworld. I touched on this subject in more general sense in my power creep video, but one point bears emphasizing: as long as ambient power creep is kept at bay, it's not a big problem. But when it comes to Neuvillette, lack of ambient power creep means that he's almost too strong for me to enjoy him as much as I would like, even at C0. Neuvillette is one of my favorite characters in the game so far, with a spectacular playstyle that I'm happy to have experienced, but I often find myself torn on whether to recommend him to people. I'd say it comes down to personal preference. If you want to feel powerful, don't mind it when the game gets a lot easier, then you'll love every second with him. If you enjoy a bit of a challenge, then maybe other characters would bring you more joy in the long run. Though of course, you could always keep him lurking in the background, ready to wash your enemies away in the blink of an eye should you ever get stuck. I must admit, having someone like him to quickly clear annoying time-wasting mobile bosses has a lot of value. Ultimately, as always, I believe in wishing for characters you like, regardless of their power level or purpose, but it's good to be aware of what they can do. Overall, I'm still happy to have him, but I'd be happier if we had some higher world levels so he wouldn't have to be relegated to Abyss cleanup duty. Until next time!